abstract thought, thinking about things, is no problem at all as long as you know that it's abstract thought. As long as you realize this is a map, this is a concept, this is a belief I'm putting on it. It's not identical to what I actually perceived about the world or what the actual world may be. But when you live in samsara, you get totally caught up in this constant cycling of it. And so you get very little input from the outside world and instead spend all your time grinding your teeth going over and over and over this kind of material. That's living in illusion, and that's what meditation attempts to do something about. Could I have the next slide, please, Cindy Lou? The general way I've been thinking about meditation lately is that they're controlled attention practices. That is, instead of letting your attention be controlled by what happens to you and your conditioned reactions brought up by what happens to you, instead you deliberately take control of what are you going to do with your attention. So instead of letting your attention cycle around and around feeding on itself as it did before, in various kinds of meditation, such as concentrative meditation, I've used the term shamatha here for it, or Dzogchen non-meditation, or Gurdjieffian self-remembering. These are various practices where you say, I'm going to keep bringing my attention back to this primary simple perception. What does the sound in this room actually sound like at this very instant? What do the sights actually look like? What does my body actually feel like at this instant? And now this instant, and now this instant, which reminds me of something that happened back in 1993. I've been drifting. Come back to what's actually happening this instance. Not what happened a few instants ago. What does it happen to now? In the kind of vipassana mindfulness meditation that people are typically started on, for instance, they'll tell you to take sensations in the body as your object of focus and try to notice what are those sensations. What's the strongest one? In fact, it's usually simplified. Pay attention to what's the strongest one and let it be whatever it is. And if your mind has wandered away, come back to it, sort of with a constant, open, questioning mind of what does it feel like now? What does it feel like now? What does it feel like now? And when you wander down the association path and memory lane and all that kind of thing, keep bringing it back. Now, what you pay attention to can vary a great deal. In classical kinds of concentrative meditation, for instance, your deliberate focus, the thing you control your attention on, is something fairly narrowly defined, like the movement of the belly in breathing, or the sensations in the nose as the air goes in and out of it, and so forth. In classical beginning vipassana, it's, say, the whole range of body sensations. What's the strongest sensation in the body this moment? And now this moment, and now this moment. It can range over a much wider field, but you keep bringing your attention back to it, trying to be equanimous about it. Notice what it actually is from moment to moment. In full-scale vipassana, as it were, the object of attention, the thing you're controlling attention to, is the entire range of phenomena happening in your mind and body. That is everything. Whatever happens, look at it with equanimity, with mindfulness, with breadth, with clarity, and see what it's like moment to moment. So meditation practices can be seen as controlled attention practices that way. Now, is there any progress in doing that? Let me talk about Shinzen Young's work for a while here. What he usually teaches is this basic kind of vipassana to begin with, of focusing on bodily sensations. He's actually primarily a Zen student himself, and his main teacher is Sasaki Roshi at the Mount Baldy Center, who he thinks is one of the most enlightened masters who's ever lived around. He's a Zen master. But he thinks that while Zen produces more colorful enlightenment when it works, Zen is much harder to learn and much harder to teach, and he can do a lot more good by teaching Vipassana, which is much more learnable by a much wider range of people. Interesting. So he starts people focusing on the body and eventually widens that so you can observe the thought processes, the emotion processes, and whatnot. Now, here's where we look at this problem of how effective is meditation. Has there been any progress in more detail? I had this conversation with Shinzen some years ago, wondering, how well does meditation work? Because I had my previous history of, it didn't work for me. And he said, well, it had been his experience and that of many other Western meditation teachers that he'd talked to, that if you gave a lecture or a workshop or a retreat or something like that, if basically you introduced 100 people to meditation, practically everybody would say, ah, this does something for me. I'm going to make this part of my life. They can taste that there's something important here in this kind of meditation practice. When you come back a year later, if 5 of them are still meditating, you're doing very well. Now, I was horrified. He says, well, you know, in the East, they don't worry about this, where these traditions come from. You know, in the East, they believe in karma. If it's your karma to come around for meditation instruction, you'll come around. If it's your karma to stay, you'll stay. If it's your karma to drop out, you'll drop out. Maybe it'll be your karma to drop in again 10 lifetimes down the road. Maybe it won't. Que sera, sera. That's not an Eastern saying, is it? But it expresses the sentiment pretty well. Now, okay, maybe that's the reality of it, but again, I'm a Westerner and I go for progress. If we had a 95% dropout rate at ITP, I would be willing to say for a few students it was too tough, but I would seriously question the way we're running the school. Okay, I mean, a 95% dropout rate, you're not doing something right. You're doing probably many things very, very wrong. So thinking about that, when I looked back at my many years of thinking of myself as a very poor meditator, was it just that I had very little talent? I mean, that was probably part of it. Or that I had very poor teaching, even though these were considered very good teachers in terms of the tradition. Sometimes I charitably would think, well, it's just in the translation into Western terms that the teaching doesn't work very well. You know, everybody gets enlightened back in the East. But no, that's not the case. They get that 95% dropout rate back there too. So I'm beginning to wonder, you know, maybe meditation is a very inefficient technique in terms of the way it's taught. So what could you do about it? Okay. Shinzen gave this a lot of thought. He's quite a scholar of the history of Buddhism in various languages and the like, as well as a meditation teacher. So when he was coming back from his many years in the East, when he was training to start teaching in the West, he thought, what's the history of Buddhism? Because Buddhism had moved from culture to culture. It moved into Tibet, for instance. But he said, you know, when it moved into Tibet, basically it moved into a relatively primitive culture and kind of took it over. So Buddhism didn't change at all itself much. I mean, you know, translated into a different language, but basically took over the culture. But when Buddhism moved into China, it moved into a very old, sophisticated culture that had its own spiritual traditions. And it had to adapt. It had to change a lot of its language. It had to change some of its concepts so that it could present itself in a way that resonated with cultured Chinese, that began to make sense to Chinese people, so they could pick it up. Same thing happened when it moved into Japan. Once again, moving into a very sophisticated culture, had to adapt considerably. What were some of the ways it adapted? Picking up high prestige language, for instance, to recouch crucial terms in. For instance, with the exception of people at ITP, for whom having a guru probably sounds pretty groovy, for the average Westerner, having a guru would be weird as hell, you know. Guru means false teacher or cult leader or something like that. But Shinzen said, well, let's translate this into languages that have high prestige in the West, like the language of psychology, of science, of math, or of sports. So you don't go out and get a guru, you get a personal trainer. Now that is speaking to us, right? Any one of us would be happy to say, well, I have a personal trainer and a personal coach, you know, or these various things here.